till we get all this right, the budgets will essentially be tinkering. And yes, there was one thing that Rachel Reeves wouldn't have done, but only the one thing. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. And I'm now joined by Helen Dewdney, the consumer expert, also known, I'm rather reticent about saying this, as Complaining Cow. That sounds a bit rude, Helen. I don't wish to offend you as you come on. But what do you think about the budget and how will it help consumers?
Well, there's a little bit of good news for the consumers in that, there's no movement on fuel and alcohol, so that will be of good news to some. There's a little bit in the national insurance obviously coming down, but the tax bracket is not going up, so we're not necessarily going to see that everybody's going to benefit from that. And I think a lot of consumers would have liked to have seen some of those tax rises and savings going into the local authorities.
Would you, are you more concerned about fiscal drag and the effect that's having on individuals, or giving more money to local authorities, which I certainly wouldn't do because I think local authorities are incompetent?
Well, having worked in one for some years ago, there is certainly some incompetency in councils, I would certainly agree. However, we are also seeing a lot of people suffering. We're seeing the people that are not getting the social care. We're seeing education and mental health really, right at the ends there. We're seeing children waiting for mental health diagnosis and help, for months and months, in some cases years. So actually, I do believe that some of us would actually like to see some of those services receive some funding so that they can support children and families. And some children and families will be helped by the changes in child benefit. I mean, it's marginal, but that will help people between £50,000 and £60,000 of income. Yeah, so we are seeing that the 50 is going up, and that I'm glad to see that the Chancellor is looking at consultation for this anomaly where a single parent household can be taxed far more on their on their child benefit than a household that's got two incomes coming in at $49.99 each. So it's good to see that will happen, but I still think that at the other end, where we're seeing people with disabilities, people who are vulnerable, that end down there was nothing in the budget for them.
And nothing much for people who have retired because they don't benefit from the national insurance cut.
And also, yeah, and you could say another vulnerable group. I think it's the vulnerable groups here that have really missed out in the budget.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. I'm delighted now to be joined by the economist and senior advisor and indeed founder of Capital Economics, England's most distinguished economist, Roger Bootle. Roger, thank you for coming in. What do you think the Chancellor should have done that would have had a bigger economic impact?
Well, let's start by saying that he was hemmed in by his own fiscal rules. Now, you criticise the OBR with some good reason, but I think, you can overdo that. I mean, the Tories, your party, set up the OBR.
I thought it was a good idea at the time.
Well, so did I.
Yes.
And actually, I still think to some extent it's a good idea. And I think they're in principle at the beginning to stop overspending and overborrowing by a Labour government.
And I thought it was well run by Robert Choate, who I thought knew what he was doing. I think it's less well run now. But
I'll leave it there, actually.
All right.
But given those constraints, there wasn't a great deal he could do. What's really disappointing, I think, about this government is the failure to get to grips with the fundamentals. And the fundamentals really concern government spending. You cannot get the tax burden substantially lower, which is what both you and I want, unless you control government spending. And that, I'm afraid, means cuts. And we're not having cuts. A great deal of fuss is being made about the growth of government spending being held to only 1% real. Well, that's quite low in relation to an economy that's growing fast, but we aren't growing fast. So I think, frankly, it's missing the target. Now, over and above that, given all those constraints, I agree with you. There were a series of small things he could have done. Now, why increase the VAT threshold for registration from 85 to 90,000? What do we think that's going to do? Very, very little. I mean, if it doubled it, that would have made a huge difference.
And John Redwood was asking for it to go up to, say, 150,000, which I was strongly supporting, which would really help small businesses.
I quite agree. So all this was really very disappointing. I must say, I thought it was a remarkable theatrical performance from the Chancellor. How he's got the brass neck to stand there and talk about lower taxes and reducing the debt burden, when, of course, taxes as a share of GDP are rising, and so is the debt burden. It's exactly the opposite of what he said.
Yes, indeed. And but he came up with some reason as to how he could explain it away. There were some figures on individual taxation that proved useful to him. But it seemed to me everything was being done by halves. The VAT you mentioned.
I agree.
The reducing capital gains tax on property that isn't your primary residence. And then this weird thing on stamp duty for if you're buying lots of houses. Well,
yes.
You just make it lots of individual transactions, don't you?
Yeah, I thought that was very strange. But my greatest puzzle was over national insurance, because I agree with you. I think this is a good measure. I think he did the right thing to cut national insurance rather than income tax, although, of course, it does no favours to pensioners. And following on from last autumn's reduction, I thought to myself, gosh, I can now, this far in, begin to see a Conservative vision, which is, for a long time, economists have talked about wanting to merge income tax and national insurance, and it was going to be very difficult to do. Now here's the way to do it, by abolishing national insurance. But he didn't mention that as an objective.
No, well, I mentioned in my monologue that this was the vision because you mentioned it to me when we were chatting beforehand. And between us, we've had to come up with the rather brilliant vision that the Chancellor's got, but he won't tell us about it.
He won't tell us, no.
You mentioned to get taxes down, we have to cut spending. Where would you cut spending?
Well, I say cut spending. There's another way, and the two are related. We've got a very high rate of people not working in this country, many of them drawing benefits. So I think we have to tackle that first of all. And there was nothing in today's budget on that, by the way. And we've got to tackle it through a mixture, I think, of sticks and carrots. Now, of course, if you get people off benefits into work, that gives you two sorts of benefits. It reduces the welfare bill. It also generates taxes from people actually working. That's, I think, got to be at the centre of what's done. Now, there are a few other areas where I think not everyone will agree with me, but I find it bizarre, given the state of affairs we're in, that we have an overseas aid budget that's actually ring-fenced, protected. I wouldn't be going down that route at all. Very difficult, of course, because lots of people I know disagree with me, but...
Well, I agree with you. I don't believe in ring-fencing expenditure. I'm also very concerned that we are still in this mindset, though the Chancellor touched on a challenge to it, that more spending automatically means better services. Whereas actually the NHS has got a lot more money, but it's using it less productively.
Yes.
These scandals in procurement expenditure in the Ministry of Defence go on and on and on.
Yes.
And that just spending more money is not the route to success. Spending it well is what matters.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And when I heard the Chancellor talk about these wonderful-sounding IT projects that are going to revolutionise productivity in the NHS, frankly, my heart sank. I mean, the mixture of the current unreformed NHS and IT projects, to me, that just spells failure.
Well, John Redwood made an excellent speech following the budget where he said productivity in the NHS is significantly below where it was pre-pandemic. I think he said 6 to 7%. When they didn't have this new IT.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it be easier to try and get back that 6 and 7% before you start spending money, and that the spend to save in this instance may come at a later stage, but actually you can get the savings without spending at this point?
Well, I absolutely agree with that. We all know that there are bits of the NHS which are really wonderful. I've benefited myself. Really wonderful. There's also massive inefficiency. And we can't simply go on pretending that this is the envy of the world and we stick with the current structure. Now, I will understand the political constraints for a Conservative government, but really it is deeply disappointing at this stage to be going on just pouring more money into it. It simply has to be reformed.
Well, I agree with that, and the only person who's saying it is Wes Streeting.
I know.
Though when I praise him, I think it's rather embarrassing for him, but I think what he's saying is very interesting. Anyway, thank you both, Helen and Roger.